If you have brown eyes, you are carrying the oldest way a human being has ever looked at the world. Not the rarest, the opposite of rare. Brown is the most common eye color on Earth by a wide margin. Somewhere close to 7 or 8 in every 10 people alive right now are looking back at this the same way you are. And for almost the entire time our species has existed, it wasn't the most common color. It was the only one. Think about that for a second. Nearly every human being who has ever lived, every hunter who followed a herd across a grassland that is now desert, every child who watched the first fires, every person whose name is lost and whose blood you still carry, looked out at their world through eyes the same color as yours. Everything else about them has vanished. Their language, their gods, their faces, but the eye remained. So here is the strange thing about the question we're going to spend the next half hour answering. When people ask where brown eyes came from, they've got it backwards. Brown eyes didn't come from anywhere. Brown is where everyone started. It's every other color that has an origin story, a beginning you can date, a place you can point to, and in one case, a single human being you can trace it back to. And the clue that cracks the whole thing open came out of a cave in northern Spain, from a skeleton 7,000 years old, whose eyes told a story nobody expected. This channel digs into the history written inside the body, the record your own cells keep of where you actually come from, sourced from the studies, not the myths. So stay with me, because by the end of this, the word brown is going to mean something much larger than a color. It's going to mean the thread that runs through the entire human family. Let's start with the first thing that's going to mess with your head. Your brown eyes aren't really brown in the way you probably imagine, as if there were some special brown dye painted onto the front of them. There isn't. The color in a brown iris is melanin, the exact same pigment that colors your skin and your hair. Packed densely into the front layer of the iris, melanin absorbs the light coming in, and what reflects back to the person looking at you reads as brown. More melanin, deeper brown. A little less, and you drift toward hazel and amber. That's all brown is, light meeting pigment. Now hold on to that, because here is the part almost nobody knows. There is no blue pigment in a human eye. None. There is no green pigment either. It doesn't exist. Nobody has blue dye or green dye in their irises, because the body never made any. So how does anyone have blue eyes? The answer is that a blue eye is a brown eye with the melanin turned down. When there's very little pigment in the front of the iris, the light coming in doesn't get absorbed. It scatters, the same way particles in the atmosphere scatter sunlight and give you a blue sky. The blue you see in a blue-eyed person is not a color that's there. It's a color that appears because the brown was taken away. The pigment stepped back, and the light did the rest. So the question flips completely. Blue isn't a color that got added to the human eye. Brown is the full signal, the complete, pigmented, ancestral version. Every lighter eye on Earth is a brown eye with something missing. And that reframes everything. We're not looking for where brown came from. We're looking for the moment the melanin was dialed back, and who it happened to, and how it spread across half the faces on the planet, while brown just stayed, the way it always had. Which brings us to a fact that sounds almost too simple to matter, but it's the whole foundation. Every human population you can name, before any of them ever met, back when they were scattered and isolated across continents, was overwhelmingly brown-eyed. Not most of them, nearly all of them. In a huge swath of the world today, from Africa to the Americas to most of Asia, brown remains not just common, but close to universal. When researchers mapped iris color across the globe, they found that outside of one corner of the world, the human eye barely varies at all. It is brown, in 1,000 shades of brown, almost everywhere. That's not a coincidence, and it's not random. In genetics, when a trait sits at the base of every branch of a family that old and that spread out, it means one thing: You're not looking at something that arose. You're looking at what was already there. The starting condition. The default the entire species inherited and carried out of its deepest past. To see how that works, you have to meet the switch. Most of what decides a human eye's color comes down to a very small piece of DNA on chromosome 15, a gene called OCA2, and a neighboring gene, HERC2, that acts like its control dial. In 2009, geneticists Richard Sturm and Tony Larson pulled the whole picture together in a review that's still a landmark, and the number they reported is startling. Roughly 74% of all the variation in human eye color traces back to this single stretch of the genome, one small region doing most of the work. Here's how the switch works in plain terms. OCA2 helps build the machinery that makes melanin in the iris. HERC2 sits next door and decides how loudly OCA2 gets to speak. There's one specific spot in that control region. Geneticists call it RS1-291-3832, and it comes in two versions. The ancestral version, the original one, leaves the switch on. OCA2 runs, melanin gets made, and the eye comes out brown. That's the setting the species started with. Then there's a changed version of that same spot, a derived version that quietly turns the volume down. Less OCA2, less melanin, and the eye that would have been brown comes out light. So when we talk about the origin of brown eyes, we're really talking about the origin of that ancestral setting, the switch left on. And that setting has no recent birthplace, no founding tribe, no dramatic date. It is simply the pigmentation our lineage brought with it out of Africa, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and never set down. For the overwhelming majority of the roughly 300,000 humans that anatomically modern humans have existed, the brown eye wasn't the leading option. It was the only option there was. Every other color is younger than the species. Brown is as old as we are. You can see that antiquity in who carries it. The ancestral setting of that switch, the one left on, making melanin, making brown, is the version found in the human lineages that branch off deepest in our shared history, including peoples of Africa whose ancestors never left the continent. It is the version that would have been carried by the common ancestors of every person alive today on every continent without a single exception. Blue, green, and hazel are recent departures, taken by some lines and not others. Brown is the ground they all departed from. So when you look at a brown iris, you are not looking at any one group's inheritance. You are looking at the inheritance that predates the very idea of separate groups, the color that was already old when the first modern humans began to spread across the earth and slowly to become everyone. Now, the one exception, because there is a color with a real origin story, and it is one of the most remarkable findings in all of human genetics. In 2008, a team led by Hans Eiberg in Copenhagen sequenced that control region in blue-eyed people from across Europe and beyond. Different countries, different backgrounds, people with no obvious connection to one another. And they found something that stopped them cold. Every single blue-eyed person they tested carried the exact same change in the exact same spot on the exact same stretch of DNA. Not similar, identical, down to the letter. There is only one honest explanation for that. It means blue eyes did not appear many times in many places. It appeared once, in one person. A single individual, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, was born with the melanin dial turned down for the first time, and every blue-eyed human being alive today, from Scandinavia to Central Asia, descends from that one ancestor. We will never know their name, or their voice, or whether they were feared or admired for looking different. But we know they lived, and we know they had children, and we know their eyes never left us. Sit with the contrast for a moment because it's the heart of this whole story. Brown is the bedrock, the deep, oldest layer the entire species is built on, laid down before any of the divisions we argue about today existed. Blue is a single thin seam that started running through one corner of that rock very recently from one point. And the place we can watch that seam appear, the moment frozen in the record, is a cave in the mountains of León in northern Spain. In 2012, researchers recovered a skeleton from a site called La Braña Arintero. He was a hunter-gatherer who lived about 7,000 years ago, before farming had reached his part of Europe. And in 2014, a team led by Iñigo Olalde and Carles Lalueza-Fox published his complete genome in the journal Nature, one of the first ever recovered from a pre-agricultural European. When they read his DNA, they found something that rewrote what a lot of people assumed about the ancient European face. This man carried the ancestral pigmentation genes for dark skin. And at the same time, in that same body, he carried the derived version of the switch, the change for light eyes. A dark-skinned man in Mesolithic Spain with the genetic signature for blue eyes. The two things we've been taught to imagine as a package, pale skin and light eyes arriving together as some ancient European default, were never a package at all. 7,000 years ago, brown-toned skin and the brand new blue eye variant sat side by side in the very same person. The light eye had appeared. The pale skin had not yet spread. The bedrock was still dark. The seam had only just begun. What La Braña man shows us, with the clarity only ancient DNA can give, is that the look we treat as timeless and fixed is neither. It was assembled, piece by piece, over the last several thousand years. A mutation here, a shift there, none of them arriving on schedule, none of them belonging together by right. Underneath all of it, the older and far more widely shared condition was the dark, pigmented, brown-eyed baseline that the rest of the planet still carries almost universally. And he wasn't alone. 2,000 kilometers to the north, in a limestone cave at Cheddar Gorge in southwest England, lies the oldest near-complete skeleton ever found in Britain. A hunter-gatherer who died around 10,000 years ago, known simply as Cheddar Man. For most of the last century, he was imagined the way we imagine ancient Britons, pale-skinned, light-featured, a distant relative of the faces in a costume drama. Then, in 2018, a team from London's Natural History Museum and University College London, Selina Brace, Chris Stringer, Mark Thomas, and their colleagues, drilled a tiny hole into the bone at the base of his skull and read what was left of his genome. The portrait that came back overturned the old assumption entirely. Cheddar Man's DNA pointed to dark, curly hair, skin the researchers described as dark to black, and light blue eyes. The same startling pairing as the man from La Braña in a completely separate population on the far side of the continent. Dark-skinned, light-eyed hunter-gatherers spread right across Mesolithic Europe. What that tells us is that these weren't one-off oddities. This was ordinary. Before farming reached the continent, before the great migrations that would remake its face, the people living where pale and blue-eyed is now imagined as timeless were in fact dark-skinned, and carrying, in some of them, the very same freshly minted light eye variant we've been following. The genes for the lighter skin now common in northwestern Europe didn't arrive until thousands of years after Cheddar Man died, riding in on later waves of farmers from the Near East and herders from the steppe. He never saw them. The bedrock in his time was still dark. Only the eye had begun to change. And that baseline is genuinely ancient, older than our species itself. Look at our closest relatives and the pattern holds. Among all the primates, only a couple of species show any real variation in eye color at all, and when geneticists checked, that variation isn't even produced by the same switch that lights up a human iris. The brown eye isn't just the human default, it's close to the primate default. It reaches back past us, into the deep evolutionary past we share with every ape in the forest. And it was never as simple as a single switch with two settings, brown, or blue. If it were, there would be no green eyes, no hazel, no amber, and yet there they are. Eye color is what geneticists call polygenic. That one region on chromosome 15 does most of the work, but a whole supporting cast of other genes, with names like TYR, TYRP1, and SLC24A4, nudge the final shade up or down. Green and hazel eyes are what you get in the middle ground, some melanin in the iris, but not the full measure, so a little of that scattered blue light shows through the pigment that remains, which means every one of those colors sits on the same single axis. Green, hazel, amber, the whole range, they are all versions of the same thing, brown, with the melanin dialed to different levels. Brown is the top of the dial, the full signal, the setting the species began with. Everything else is a step or two down from it. There is no separate green pigment, no separate hazel dye, any more than there is a blue one. There is only melanin, and how much of it the front of a given iris happens to hold. The rainbow of human eyes people find so striking is really one color, seen at a dozen depths. Now step back from Europe entirely, because this is where the real scale of it lands. Everything we've been tracing, the light eye variant, the dialing down of the melanin, the man from Braña and Cheddar man both, is a story that plays out in a single corner of the world. When researchers mapped iris color across populations from Europe, East Asia, and South Asia, the pattern was unmistakable. The wide spread of eye colors exists mainly in the West, and across the rest of the planet, the eye stays remarkably, consistently brown. Consider East Asia. Skin there did lighten over thousands of years, much as it did in Europe, but the genetics tell us it happened largely through different changes, a separate road to a similar place. Convergence, not shared inheritance. And through all of that, the eye stayed brown. Follow the first peoples of the Americas across the Bering Land Bridge, and brown travels the whole distance with them, from the Arctic to Patagonia. Sit in a village in the Andean highlands, or the Punjab, or the Sahel, and the eye looking back at you is the same deep brown that looked out of the very first human faces. So the light eye isn't the human story, it's a footnote to it, a recent local variation in one region among many. The human story, the part shared by the overwhelming majority of everyone alive, is brown. It always was. So follow the thread outward and watch how little it respects the borders we care about. The brown eye crosses every one of them. It is the constant in a Peruvian grandmother and a Nigerian toddler, and a farmer in the Punjab, and a fisherman in the Philippines. People separated by every ocean, every language, every line ever drawn on a map, united by the single oldest visible trait a human being can carry. Trace any of their family trees back far enough, back a few hundred generations, and you don't find neat separate lineages. You find the same brown-eyed ancestors appearing over and over, thousands of times over, in every single one of those trees. Because that far back, the trees stop being separate at all. They braid into one. That's the thing the mapmakers never managed to capture. The eye doesn't know about nations. It was here before the first nation, and it will outlast the last one. It was passed down through people who worshipped gods no one remembers, who spoke languages that left no trace, who would have understood nothing about each other except, perhaps, the recognition of looking into a familiar pair of eyes. Older than any border, older than any flag, older than any of the categories we now use to tell each other apart. So let's bring this all the way back to you. If you're watching this with brown eyes of your own, here's what it actually means, and it's the opposite of what the loudest voices on the internet want to make of a trait. It does not make you older or truer or more original than anyone else, and being the ancestral version doesn't make it the superior version. That's not what ancestral means. Ancestral means shared. It means that when you look in the mirror, you're looking at the one feature that connects you not to a tribe, but to nearly the whole of humanity. to the overwhelming majority of every person who has ever drawn breath. Your brown eyes aren't a badge that sets you apart. They're the proof of how little truly separates any of us. And it works in the other direction just as gently. If your eyes are blue or green or hazel, you're not carrying something better either. You're carrying a recent, local, beautiful variation that appeared on top of that shared foundation a few thousand years ago in one corner of the world. Not a rung on a ladder, a ripple on very old, very deep water. The blue-eyed and the brown-eyed aren't two kinds of people. They're the same story, read at two different depths. That's what La Braña man really left us, lying in the dark of a Spanish cave for 7,000 years. Not proof of who was here first, or who is purest, or any of the things people reach for when they want ancestry to sort humanity into ranks. He left us a picture of a moment before any of that sorting made sense. A dark-skinned, light-eyed man who fits none of our neat categories because the categories are younger than he is and shallower than the DNA he carried. The brown eyes survived all of it. It survived the ice ages and the migrations, the empires that rose to rank people by their faces and then crumbled into dust while the faces went on. Every person alive today who carries it is living proof that it made it through. An unbroken line handed down through 100,000 years of people you'll never know to arrive, finally, at you. So the next time you catch your own eyes in a window or a screen, remember what you're actually looking at. Not just a color. The oldest, most common, most widely shared way a human being has ever seen the world. A piece of bedrock older than every nation that ever flew a flag. The one thing we very nearly all have in common, hiding in plain sight, in the middle of your face. Older than any border, older than any name, older than the very idea that we were ever really different at all. That's the story written in your eyes. If it moved you or surprised you, stay a while. There's a whole human family in here waiting to be traced.